I never thought the beginning of our downfall would be so quiet. It all started the day we buried my father. The sky was gray, as if it already knew something we didn't. I remember standing by the grave, surrounded by my family, truly believing, really believing, that despite the pain, we were still a united family. We hugged each other, cried together, repeated the same worn-out phrases. He would want us to stay united. Family is all that matters. Nothing will change between us. How naive we were. My father had always been the pillar. Not just because of the money, yes, he had properties, savings, a life built through sacrifice, but because he was the one who kept the peace. The mediator. The one who knew when to stay silent and when to impose order. While he was alive, conflicts never went beyond uncomfortable murmurs at family dinners. With him gone, everything was exposed. A week after the funeral, we gathered at the lawyer's office. It was a small place, too white, with a silence heavier than grief itself. Everyone was there. My siblings, my uncles, a cousin who almost never showed up but arrived early that morning. No one spoke much. The air was thick with a strange mix of sadness and expectation, as if we were all trying to convince ourselves this was just another formality. The lawyer cleared his throat and said something that still echoes in my head. The will is simple. Your father left everything clearly stated. Simple. That word calmed us. Properties divided, accounts distributed, a few personal items with sentimental value carefully assigned. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing unfair. I even remember thinking, this went better than I expected. But as the lawyer read, I began to notice things. Glances that met and quickly looked away. A sigh held a second too long. The slight tremble in my brother's hand when he heard a number. My aunt's stiff smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes. When the lawyer finished, an awkward silence filled the room. No one spoke, no one moved, until someone, I won't say who because it still hurts, said the sentence that changed everything. Is that all? It wasn't an innocent question. It was an accusation disguised as one. The lawyer looked up, surprised, and explained that yes, that was the complete will, signed, reviewed, legal, impeccable. But it was already too late. It doesn't make sense, another voice said. Dad would never have wanted it this way. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, because that sentence wasn't about love. It was about dissatisfaction, about comparison, about I deserved more. I tried to intervene, to calm things down, to remind them that we were still mourning, that this wasn't the moment, that my father trusted us. But something had already broken. When we left the office, no one suggested going out to eat together. No one hugged anyone. Each of us went our separate way, like strangers forced to share the same last name. That night, I received the first message. A short message, cold. We need to talk about the will. It didn't say why. It didn't say for what. But deep down, I knew it was no longer about clarifying anything. It was about fighting. And without realizing it, that day we didn't just read a will. We activated a ticking time bomb that had been waiting for years to explode. The message I received that night wasn't the last one. It was the first of many. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Family group chats that had been silent for years suddenly came back to life, flooded with long, tense messages, carefully worded to sound respectful, yet dripping with poison. No one was shouting yet. No one was accusing anyone directly, but everyone was implying. We just want to understand Dad's decisions better. Some things don't add up. I'm not saying anyone did anything wrong, but that became unbearable. The conversations were no longer about my father. They were about money, about who had lived longer in which house, about who had taken care of him more, about past favors that suddenly looked like unpaid debts. Every memory turned into currency. My sister was the first to say it out loud during an impromptu gathering at my aunt's house. I was the one who was there when Dad got sick, she said, arms crossed. I don't see that reflected in the will. My brother answered without raising his voice, but with a coldness I had never heard from him before. And that gives you the right to more? The air became suffocating. No one was really listening. Everyone was speaking from old wounds. Things I thought were long buried resurfaced with names, dates, and precise accusations. Childhood mistakes. Decisions that were never forgiven. Favoritism we always denied but now felt undeniable. I looked around and didn't recognize my own family. That was when someone said it, almost casually. Maybe Dad was pressured. The silence was brutal. Pressured by whom? I asked. No one answered. They didn't need to. From that moment on, suspicion settled in like a permanent shadow. Every gesture, every visit during my father's final years, every private conversation with him was reinterpreted under a dark lens. What once looked like love now felt like strategy. A few days later, I found out one of my uncles had gone to see a lawyer just to get informed. That phrase started repeating itself until it lost all meaning. Getting informed slowly turned into preparing for war. The calls were no longer about how we were holding up. They were warnings. This isn't going to end like this. We're not accepting something that's clearly unfair. You'd better be ready. Sides began to form. People who had never gotten along suddenly stood together. Others, once inseparable, stopped speaking altogether. At every family gathering, there were empty chairs, absences that hurt more than the arguments. One night, while going through my father's old papers, I found a handwritten note. It wasn't about money, it was about peace, about his fear that once he was gone, we would destroy each other over things that didn't truly matter. I cried harder than I had at the funeral, because while he tried to keep us united even after death, we were already sharpening our knives. The notice arrived a week later. A formal letter, cold language, legal seals. The will would be contested. And with that decision, whatever remained of our family crossed an invisible line, one we would never be able to step back from. The day the first court notice arrived, I understood something terrifying. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a war. Seeing my father's name on a legal document, surrounded by words like lawsuit, contest, and nullification, made my stomach turn. It felt like we were burying him a second time, only now without respect, without silence, without grief. The lawyers took control almost immediately. Each side had their own, each with their own version of the truth. I could barely keep up with the emails, phone calls, and meetings. Suddenly, my life revolved around deadlines and sterile offices where no one asked how we were coping, only what we could prove. Then came the testimonies, and with them, the lies. I listened as people I had loved my entire life said things I never imagined they were capable of saying. Twisted versions of reality, rewritten memories, intentions attributed to my father that he would have never recognized as his own. Dad always said this wasn't fair. He promised me something different. He wasn't in his right mind when he signed. Every sentence was a stab, not just because of what they said, but because of what they implied. That my father didn't know what he was doing, or worse, that someone had taken advantage of him. One of the hardest moments came when witnesses were called. Neighbors, old friends, even a nurse who had cared for my father in his final months. Outsiders now dissected our private life in front of strangers, speculating about his mental state, his relationships, his supposed weaknesses. I listened as they spoke about him like he was an object. Meanwhile, the family fell apart in real time. Birthdays ignored, holidays canceled, messages left unread. In the courthouse hallways, we passed each other like complete strangers. If our eyes met, it was only to fill with resentment. But the worst was yet to come. During one of the hearings, the opposing lawyer presented a document none of us had ever seen before. An old paper signed years earlier, supposedly proving a different intention from my father. I remember the murmur in the room. I remember my lawyer stiffening beside me. I remember the barely hidden smile on someone sitting across from me. That document didn't just threaten the will, it threatened to change everything. We began investigating its origin, and the more we dug, the more inconsistencies surfaced. Dates that didn't match, signatures that looked slightly off, witnesses who couldn't quite remember. Then came the revelation that took my breath away. The document had been kept by someone in the family, someone present at every meeting, someone we trusted. This wasn't an external attack. It wasn't a legal mistake. It was an internal betrayal. That night, I couldn't sleep. I realized I was no longer fighting over an inheritance. I was fighting against people who knew every one of my weaknesses, every fear, every shared memory, and still chose to use them as weapons. The trial dragged on, but something had been permanently shattered. Because when blood turns against blood in a courtroom, there is no longer family, only winners and losers. And the very next day, a new piece of evidence surfaced. One no one expected. One that wouldn't just decide the case, but would expose a truth we had avoided for decades. The evidence arrived in a plain yellow envelope. No drama, no warning. And yet, it felt unbearably heavy in my hands. Inside was an old medical report, several personal letters, and a legal record that had never been presented in court. None of them spoke directly about money. They spoke about decisions. Decisions my father had made in silence, believing he was protecting us. As I read through them, everything began to make sense. My father had known his death wouldn't start the conflict. It would only be the final trigger. The medical report confirmed something few of us knew. In his final years, my father was fully mentally competent, but emotionally exhausted. He had watched the family slowly fracture, seen resentment grow beneath polite smiles, and, most painfully, he had identified exactly where that fracture came from. The letters were devastating. In them, my father admitted that for decades he had allowed small injustices, quiet favoritism, and decisions made to avoid immediate arguments, but which planted long-term resentment. He confessed he had stayed silent when he should have spoken, protected some, hurt others without fully realizing it. But the final confession shattered us. The will was never meant to be fair. It was meant to be corrective. My father had divided the inheritance not based on affection, but on damage. He tried to rebalance an emotional scale only he fully understood. He did it without explanations, without goodbyes, without preparing any of us for the truth. Then we saw the name. A name none of us expected in that context. Someone central to the current conflict had manipulated the family narrative for years, not to claim more money directly, but to make sure others received less. Old envy, a wound that never healed, a quiet revenge that now exploded in front of everyone. When that name was spoken aloud in court, no one moved. Not even the lawyers. Because this was no longer a legal battle. It was the emotional corpse of a family laid bare. Some cried, others denied everything. One person stormed out of the courtroom and never returned. I stayed seated, frozen, realizing that no matter how the judge ruled, nothing here could be undone. The trial continued, but it had lost its meaning. The truth was out, and it was too heavy to ignore. We hadn't inherited property or money. We had inherited decades of silence. And as the judge prepared to deliver the final verdict, one thought chilled me to the bone. It didn't matter who won the case. The family had already lost. The verdict came on an ordinary morning. No ceremony, no emotion, as if it hadn't just decided years of hatred, exhaustion, and emotional ruin. The judge upheld the will. Legally, my father had done everything right. Every signature, every date, every decision was protected by the law. There were no dramatic punishments, no absolute winners. Just a ruling that closed the case and opened an emptiness nothing could fill. When we walked out of the courtroom, no one celebrated. Some avoided eye contact. Others left without saying goodbye. One person, the same one whose name had unleashed the truth, vanished from our lives that very day. Changed numbers, moved away, cut all ties, as if disappearing could erase what had been done. They never called again. The money was distributed. The properties changed hands. The papers were signed. Everything we had fought so desperately for was finally settled, exactly as the law dictated. And yet, no one was okay. Family dinners vanished. Birthdays became uncomfortable dates. Silence replaced arguments. With time, I realized we didn't lose our family because of money, but because of what the money exposed. The inheritance merely tore away the veil covering years of unspoken resentment, quiet comparisons, and wounds no one ever healed. I changed too. I lost the innocence of believing blood was enough to hold people together. I lost people I thought would be in my life forever. What I gained was caution, distance, and a sadness that still surfaces when I remember who we used to be. Sometimes I reread my father's letters, not with anger, but with a bitter understanding. He tried to fix with a document what he never dared to confront while alive, and that was his greatest mistake. And ours. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this: never underestimate the destructive power of unresolved conflict. Never mistake silence for peace. And never believe an inheritance is just about money. Because in our case, the inheritance didn't leave us houses or bank accounts. It left us broken memories. It left us absence. It left us a family that no longer exists. And the saddest part of all, no one won.